Okay, it's 2:02, so I think I'm going to kick off now. So welcome everybody to our webinar on reflections from COP26. We're delighted to see such a large amount of interest in the webinar. This is part of the CCSA's webinar series, which is a series of monthly webinars that alternate between member-only webinars and webinars that also include external stakeholders like this one. Future webinars programme is on the CCSA website, www.ccsassociation.org, and I would encourage you to go there and have a look at what else is open to stakeholders. So we've chosen Zoom meeting because we much prefer the interaction between Q&A and the speakers when we have a Zoom meeting, and we want to see who's asking the questions. But during the presentation elements of the webinar, we'd really appreciate it if you remain muted and switch your cameras off. When you come in during Q&A, that's when we'd like you to put your camera on, obviously, and unmute when I ask you to do so. And I'll be moderating the Q&A. And also, if Q&A appear in the chat, please feel free to post those throughout the presentations, and we will pick them up at the end as best we can. Yeah, if you're asking a question orally, we'd like you to give your name and then your question. So a bit of context, why this webinar now? Well, it is a little while since COP26, which took place on the 1st to the 13th of November, but it was a particularly high profile COP for carbon capture, utilisation and storage, or CCUS, and particularly around this necessity of industrial CCUS and negative emissions technologies. We think it was a success, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my thoughts on that in a moment, but I think I'm really interested in hearing from our two speakers about what they think about it, and particularly not just reflections but more with a forward-looking hat on. I've asked them to think about CCUS developments going forward and what needs to happen throughout the rest of this year and in future COP to make sure that CCUS plays the important role it needs to play in fighting global climate change. So it's an opportunity to hear from all three of us. We all attended COP26, and without further ado, I'll introduce the speakers. So I've got Tim Dixon here from the IEA GHG programme. He's Director and General Manager there, and Guluran Turin, who is the General Manager, Advocacy and Communications at the Global CCS Institute. So welcome to both of you. First of all, I'm going to, Tim is going to be talking to us particularly about some of the text agreed, Article 6, and the relationship to CCUS and sort of what we can expect perhaps from the future COP process. And Guluran will also have some reflections on that, but I've also asked her to talk to us about her recently published report on the global status of CCS. So I'm really looking forward to that. So without further ado, I'll just give a little bit more intro to Tim. Tim, as I said, is the head of the IEA GHG, appointed in June 2019 as General Manager, and it's the international research organisation focused on development and deployment of carbon capture, utilisation and storage. So Tim is responsible for managing the IEA GHG, ensuring it meets members' needs and delivers the technical evidence base to support CCS development and deployment. And as part of that, he inputs to the international regulatory and policy developments, such as UNFCCC, IPCC and Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum. So Tim, thank you for joining us, and yeah, give us your COP26 reflections and your thoughts on the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruth, for the scene setting, and thank you for the introduction. So let me just share my screen and check that you are all seeing that my main screen. Are you seeing that fine, Ruth? Are you seeing my main screen?
Yes, I am, Guluran, yeah.
Okay, Guluran, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Update from, well, reflections on COP26 and from the CCUS perspective as well. It was a very busy COP, a very interesting COP, a very important COP. I guess, first of all, I should just show my disclaimer slide that we're a technology collaboration program related and set up by the International Energy Agency, but autonomous from them. So anything I say doesn't reflect them or their views. And our role at COPs, as Ruth just described, really is being information providers, both to the delegates and into the negotiations where they are CCUS specific or relevant, and also tracking the negotiations where there is implications and relevance for CCUS as well. So our role there is as information provider. Now this COP, as you probably all know, was had a lot of expectations about it because there had been a postponement from the previous year, and at the same time, because the Paris Agreement is based upon the nationally determined contributions, these are each country's voluntary pledges on its mitigation actions. The first update of those was required by 2020. So this had been postponed in essence as well. So COP26 was the first COP with these NDCs being updated. And of course, it was under COVID restrictions as well, but it was also in person as well as virtual aspects. So it was a very high attendance numbers at this COP, and it was very busy in the COP. Now, these were the UK presidency goals for this COP, and they reflect the main goals of this COP as well. The first was to secure global net zero to 2050 and keep 1.5 degrees warming by the end of the century within reach. And because of the updated NDCs, I think they've just about kept 1.5 within reach. The second was on adaptation, increasing funding for adaptation, particularly for developing countries. They made some progress towards that, but not enough in many countries' views. Related to that is the third point, which is mobilizing climate finance to developing countries, because prior even to the Paris Agreement, there was an agreement for developed countries to provide $100 billion per annum by 2020. They didn't meet that, and the expectation on the agreement is that's pushed back. That level is pushed back to 2023 now. I think they only got to some 60 billion when they counted it all up for 2020. And the fourth point, and very important point, is finalising the outstanding parts of the Paris Agreement's rule book to enable its implementation and to increase collaboration and to finalise the enhanced transparency frameworks as well. So within the Paris Agreement, there is this Article 6 on international cooperation among countries in the achievement of their nationally determined contributions. And there's three parts to Article 6, 6.2, which are between countries, internationally transferable mitigation outcomes, ITMOs, and 6.4, which is a mechanism, which is essentially project-based, like the Clean Development Mechanism. So that was all achieved as well. So in the overall picture, what was really interesting, and I think a first in my experience, given that the NDCs had to be updated, and the UNFCCC did their stock take late summer of where the updated ones were going to take us to in terms of an emissions trajectory to the end of the century, and they were still only taking us towards 2.7 degrees. And if you can recall that before Paris, we were on our way to 3.6 or something like that. Paris Agreement NDCs got that down to around 2.7, so not much progress. But there was a rush of NDC submissions in the weeks just before COP26, and which was very good. And Climate Action Tracker did their analysis and did their forward projection on the emissions trajectories from those, if these were all realised. and they now put us on a path to 2.4 degrees. So it's not enough. It's not 2 degrees. It's a long way from 1.5 degrees, but it's a progression in the right direction. And it felt like it was happening almost in real time through the COP, which was very good. Now, the NDCs have to be reported, they have to be transparent, and countries are sort of held to those by peer pressure by other countries under the Paris Agreement. Less rigorous are the net zero pledges that countries are making, net zero by 2050, 2060, 2070. But a rash of those came in as well. So that countries aren't held to those as strictly as they are to the NDCs. But the IEA, my colleagues in the IEA in Paris, worked through the night during COP and took the new pledges that came just before and during COP that were previously on taking us to 2.1 degrees C, if all implemented, if all achieved, would now take us to 1.8. So again, real progression in the political agreements coming forwards. The actual NDCs themselves, as of the 9th of November, of the 123 submitted, only 19 that I could count had CCS in. So that's not so many. But bear in mind, these are looking to 2030, actions up to 2030. But what's more promising is that the Paris Agreement requires these long-term greenhouse gas strategies, or LTSs, looking to the mid-century. These make countries look beyond their political administration horizons. And 43 countries have submitted those, and in my counting, 33 have CCS in them explicitly. And this is as they realize they're putting in the easier to do mitigation options in their NDCs. But after that, they've got to go further, they've got to keep progressing. And so that's where CCS comes in. So those are looking more promising, and countries looking further ahead, and reflects what the IEA say about the need for CCS. 25% of the energy sector mitigation efforts have got to come from CCUS to achieve net zero by 2050 in the IEA's net zero report. The overall agreement that came out of Glasgow, the Glasgow Climate Pact, was also good in that it welcomed the IPCC's first report from the AR6 process on the science of climate change. This NDC process, instead of just waiting for another 5 years for them to be updated, it calls for them to be updated again by the end of this year, 2022. It has a section on encouraging clean energy technologies and the transition to those. And within that, there is words around the phase down of coal power and the phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Now, during the negotiations, a very important clarification was added, and that's the word highlighted in yellow here, unabated coal power. That clarification means that coal power with CCS is still okay under this Glasgow Climate Pact. But also it's very significant that fossil fuels have been mentioned explicitly and coal power explicitly in this overall agreement. That's the first time from a COP agreement. And also, as you might have known in the headlines at the very end of COP, the wording was watered down by India and China from phase out of unabated coal power to phase down. But nonetheless, that's still very significant that it's even in there. So Article 6 on the international cooperation. So decision texts were reached on both these main two parts from our perspective and from the CCUS perspective, Article 6.2, Article 6.4. Both have good provisions within them to maintain their greenhouse gas accounting integrity. They rely upon corresponding adjustments being made. So if emissions reductions are transferred between countries, there are corresponding adjustments in each country's reporting under its NDC. So there's provisions in there for transparency, for accuracy, for completeness, and for consistency. And from a CCUS perspective, both Article 6.2 and 6.4 are technology neutral. So they're implicitly including CCS, they're not excluding it. And they actually explicitly include removals, which means things to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, which means engineered removals such as direct air capture. So there was just one note of caution that I spotted during the negotiations, that text was inserted in the 6.4 about avoiding locking in carbon intensive practices. And that was in the final decision text. And because that could be interpreted as excluding anything, if even CCS on fossil fuel use where there's no emissions because you've got CCS on it, such as on a cement plant or anything. But following up and making inquiries during and after, the intention with this text being inserted was not to exclude CCS at all. It had other intentions. So we are reassured by that in the intentions, but hope that some clarification can be given on this. But so the decision text is there. It's not all done because there's further work being asked through this year and onwards, and further recommendations to finalise some of the details. So that was in the UNFCCC. In the margins, or in parallel with the UNFCCC, there were other agreements. And I won't go through this full list here, but to note of interest is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, with a very large amount of money being pledged by a lot of financial institutions. Be interesting to see the details on that, and hope there is technology neutrality in the application of that. To note also the US-China bilateral agreement, which includes CCUS and direct air capture, so that even though, given their other differences, they can still collaborate on climate, which is very good. And the example with South Africa, one country with several other developed countries putting serious money, 1.85 billion, to assist South Africa in their just energy transition. We've not seen the details of what that will be, but certainly it's about phasing out unabated coal, or phasing out coal power, certainly, and increasing renewables there. And the US, with their initiatives, their carbon direct removal, energy earthshot goal was launched to achieve the cost of removing CO2 from the atmosphere of just $100 a tonne by 2030. And they also launched their Mission Innovation CDR with the goal of achieving 100 million tonnes per annum by 2030 by engineered CDR as well. In terms, those are the official negotiations and outputs and the agreements between countries. There's also a side event activity at COPs. There was a lot of side events at this COP, and there were a lot of side events on CCS and CCUS, at least a dozen. 2 of them were the official UNFCCC side events, and here it was great to collaborate with CCSA and the University of Texas in getting one of the official events, and that's the photo on the top left, but also other events with GCSI, IETA, IPICA. Very important that these are undertaken because these provide information into this very rich, busy environment of a COP. From our perspective, we're there trying to inform, in particular, countries who are coming along new to CCS, developing countries asking whether they can do it for themselves. And also, as well as these CCS side events, a growing theme, I think, was side events on CDR, or negative emissions, or engineered negative emissions. Increasing attention be given to that because it's highlighted in the IPCC's Working Group 1 report, and the IEA and others are saying that we do need it now for the climate targets. So that's inside the COP. Inside and outside, I'll just show these pictures to give you a flavour of the environment. There were civil society protests. Those inside COP were fairly limited and did not disrupt negotiations. That's really important. So in the past, they have done a bit. That's the top left photograph. The bottom left photograph is the big march in the middle of the weekend of COP, 100,000 people through Glasgow. Top right is the normal Fossil of the Day award of the Climate Action Network that try and embarrass countries into who've not been doing so well in the negotiations. They didn't. This is what they normally do at a COP, a physical award every day. They did it virtually at this COP because of COVID, but they still did it every day. And for a first time, it wasn't just countries who got the award, but IETA got the award for having fossil fuel company delegates in its delegation, which is a bit of a surprise. And the point I show this slide for is that I listened afterwards, soon afterwards, to Chris Stark, the CEO of the UK's Climate Change Committee, and he reflected, obviously he was very busy inside the COP, that the governments attending this COP had pressures from both sides, from businesses wanting certainty and action on climate change, and from civil society. And these pressures from both sides possibly gave governments more confidence in their decision making, and certainly the pressure on them was a good thing. So it was a good thing, and it didn't disrupt the negotiations. So that's very important. To end with then the gaps and what's next. Well, what's next is there's still details to be worked through on Article 6. So the subsidiary body for science and technological advice under the UNFCCC at its meeting in June is being asked to develop recommendations on how to deal with least developed countries, on more detail in registries, reporting. It's going to have some workshops and so on for the 6.2, Article 6.2. For Article 6.4, more deep recommendations on transition of CDM activities, whether emissions avoidance is eligible. And importantly, for Article 6.4, a supervisory body will be established, like the Clean Development Mechanism, CDM Executive Board. This will have a similar role in supervising the mechanism under 6.4. So that has to be established. And among its work list is to develop recommendations for MRV for removals and also for reversals of removals, i.e. if they emit to atmosphere again. So that's the what next. And the gaps, well, the only one I would really point to is in the IPCC Greenhouse Gas Inventory Guidelines, which each country is used to report their national inventory of greenhouse gases, covers CCS since 2006, covers BECCS, covers biochar to some degree since the 2019 refinement, but they do not cover direct air capture or other engineered CDR. And if countries are going to be using these, really there ought to be some framework for their reporting so they can be acknowledged consistently and appropriately at the international level. So all of this will happen, and IPCC will produce its AR6 report probably around September time. It will be taken into account by countries going into then COP27 in Egypt in November later this year. So overall, I think this was a good COP. It was achieved as much as it could possibly be expected to achieve, given that you've got to get all 197 countries agreeing in this UNFCCC environment. It was good for CCUS to get this certainty out and agreed, particularly on Article 6. And it was also good to be working in person again, I think, from a personal view. So that's my summary. I've probably gone a little bit over. And I welcome very much Galoran's take on the COP outcomes and the work next as well. So Galora will be talking about some of the similar outcomes, I'm sure, but with her perspective. So thank you very much, and we'll take questions afterwards.
Thanks, Tim. So let's move on to Galoran. Galoran is, if Tim, you can stop sharing your screen. Galoran is the General Manager of Advocacy and Communications at the Global CCS Institute, which is an international think tank whose mission is to accelerate the deployment of CCS. She's based in London and has responsible for that advocacy team globally, including activities focused on the UNFCCC and related bodies. She has extensive experience in energy and climate from 2015 to 2017, she led the government affairs activities at the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline. Lauren, without further ado, look forward to hearing about your recent report and your views on COP. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth, and thanks very much to the CCSA for inviting me, and of course, thanks a lot to Tim for this very comprehensive summary overview of 26. As Tim said, I'm sure you'll hear some of the same things from me as well, and I'll try to kind of give a little bit of my take, a little bit of my perspectives on some of the outcomes. As Tim said, expectations were COP26 were really high after a year's delay, but also it's been a year in which we saw hundreds of, actually a sort of significant number of countries and thousands of companies commit to net zero targets. Nevertheless, the first day of the conference felt a little bit ominous, reminded those of us in Glasgow of Copenhagen conference, and I'm looking forward to actually hearing Ruth's reflections on that too, because I know she was there as well. It wasn't perhaps as cold as Copenhagen, but it was fairly cold, and there seemed to be some logistical challenges in getting in. So just sort of the first day didn't seem to bode so well, but actually against this backdrop, it did turn out to be. It did turn out to deliver some really important results, agreements, announcements, and of course, last but not the least, the Glasgow Climate Pact. After the 2 weeks in Glasgow, experts, commentators have started to assess the results, and people generally seemed to fall into two camps: those that consider the COP26 as a glass half empty, and those that seem to consider it as looking at it as a glass half full. And I think I fall into the latter category, where I think COP26 was a success, albeit a qualified success. And why do I think it's a qualified success? I've kind of tried to jot down some key achievements throughout the 2 weeks from COP26, but also some of the caveats around those achievements. And of course, the key achievement, as Tim said, was keeping the, let's say, the hope for 1.5 alive, based on the updated NDCs and based on the net zero pledges. We are on track for somewhere between 1.8 to 2.4 degrees, depending on which measure one looks at, rather than 2.7, which seemed to be where we were headed before the conference. But we still need to do a lot more in order to head for 1.5. Again, as Tim said, the completion of the Paris Rulebook, particularly with Article 6, but also on transparency issues around transparency and common time frames. The adoption was a huge success in Glasgow. Of course, I'll come back to Article 6 a little bit later, but there had been a lot of leading up to COP26 sort of negotiations and haggling between countries on some issues, particularly on old CDM credits. And of course, reaching a compromise involved transferring old CDM credits from the 2013-2020 period into the new mechanism to be formed, potentially up to 300 million tons worth of old credits, but could be a lot less. And again, kind of, it was a compromise reached, and what I understand from the experts is that it's perhaps could have been worse, but that was the outcome. And another key target was or is climate finance to developing countries. 100 billion is still the goal, so that's positive. But of course, let's remind ourselves that that's 100 billion per annum, and 2020 was the target year for this. Of course, we've not achieved it, and now the target, whilst is the same, as now pushed out to 2025. And again, as Tim mentioned, Glasgow Climate Pact mentions phase down of unabated coal, and of course of inefficient and ending inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And the mention of fossil fuel for the first time, the use of the word unabated, really positive. But of course, again, a last minute sort of haggling from India and China in particular meant that it wasn't phased out of unabated coal, but phased down. And again, kind of, we're not whilst we talk about the climate pact, talked about fossil fuel subsidies, it didn't talk about the use of fossil fuels, I guess, in general. So when we look back, clearly major outcomes delivered. I think the sentiment, though, is that given where we need to be in terms of reaching 1.5, if this had been delivered a few years ago, perhaps it would have been hailed as a major, phenomenal success. I think the feeling is that it's great, but we need to move a lot faster. When we look at COP26 and implications for CCUS and engineered CDR, I think it was one that was positive, probably moderately, but it was one that was positive for the technology or the technology suite. Article 6 implementation details finally largely completed. That's phenomenal, it's the completion of Article 6 is largely shows an endorsement of carbon markets, both compliance and voluntary carbon markets. Again, echoing Tim, the fact that it's technology neutral is great for CCS and CDR, and in fact it recognizes both, not just carbon capture and storage, but also carbon dioxide removal and engineered carbon dioxide removal. There were plethora of side events on CCS and CDR, and in the plot on the right, it's a shameless little advertising for the event that we held together. You can see on my right Tim, and for the right Ruth, but there have been also numerous very high quality side events by CCSA, IEA, GHG, other organizations like Bellona, Clean Air Task Force, etc. And I think what was different this year to me is the general sort of more positivity around CCS in these side events, particularly as it relates to industrial emissions, but also engineered carbon dioxide removal. Obviously, we've been hearing a lot during COPs about nature-based solutions, which are hugely important and necessary, but also we know that we'll need engineered removals as well, and the side events, the number of side events on the topic in COP26, I think, showed the momentum and were really positive. Some new initiatives announced. There's a new CDR mission under Mission Innovation that's co-led by US, Saudi Arabia, and Canada, and wants to advance CDR technologies, engineered CDR, to see a net reduction of 100 million tons of CO2 globally by 2030. Again, Secretary Granholm announced US DOE a carbon negative Earthshot, which aims to reduce the cost of engineered CDR to $100 a ton. So quite a few at different levels and in different spheres, quite a few advances and actions, positivity around carbon capture, storage, and removal. Against this backdrop, what is the status of carbon capture and storage globally? So as the Global CCS Institute, we release our flagship report, The Global Status of CCS, every year. And it used to coincide with the COP itself, but this year we released it ahead of COP in order to provide insights and policy recommendations into the conversations and into the negotiations. The report is available on our website. We released it in October 2021, and the picture is basically one of increased momentum. This is a chart of the global capacity CCS facility pipeline of facilities that are in operation, under construction, or under development. And as you can see, the pipeline of facilities has been growing since 2017, or now 4 years in a row. In 2021, compared to 2020, we saw almost a 30%, 1/3 increase in the capacity of the facilities in the pipeline. We have currently 28 facilities operating around the world, capturing and storing close to 40 million tons of CO2 per annum, 4 in construction and 102 in development. And in 2021, we added some more than 70 facilities to our database, showing this enormous interest and investment and again, momentum in CCS. So this is a table of facilities around the world. It shows the geographic spread. And in this sense, North America, and particularly the US, leads the CCS scoreboard with the largest number of facilities, both in operation and under development. And that's because to those of us in the which I imagine most of the audiences in the CCS space, we know that the US has some very progressive and the long term has had progressive and supportive policies for CCS, including the 45Q tax credit. But lo and behold, whilst Europe does not have that many facilities that are operating, it has quite a lot under development. Of course, this also applies to the UK, where we're all based, and in fact, in Europe, we've had a number of countries that sort of enter the CCS landscape and have sort of their first facilities under development, such as Sweden, Denmark, Italy, just to name a few. And number of facilities in the Middle East. In fact, earlier this morning, we were having a webinar on the progress of CCS in the Middle East, in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, but also rest of the world too. So we're having a number of other countries that are starting to have CCS facilities under development, including, for example, last year we saw Malaysia and Indonesia enter again the sort of the CCS global map. How does this translate into countries' climate plans? As Tim mentioned, Paris Agreement, under the Paris Agreement, countries have their nationally determined contributions, NDCs, that they need to revisit, and also their long-term, low greenhouse gas emission development strategies. The NDCs are 5 to 10 year period time horizon versus long-term strategies look out to 2050. As Tim said, this is our count of the countries with CCS in their NDCs. We counted 18, I think might have been one that's missing, that you see on the right-hand side. And this is, of course, if we recall that the signatories to the Paris Agreement are more than 190. So it's a relatively small number in the large scheme of things. But as again, Tim said, when we look at the submitted long-term strategies, almost 80% of those, there have been more than 40 submitted so far, they have CCS, which is really promising. What we'd expect to see is kind of as countries move forward, that CCS kind of comes into their short to medium term strategies and plans, i.e. their NDCs. But what I would like to point out about the table on the NDCs is, as you can see, some countries have CCS facilities that are under development, and wouldn't it make sense for them to have CCS in their NDCs as well, like Malaysia and New Zealand, versus there are other countries that have CCS in their NDCs, but don't have any, as far as we're aware, that don't have any commercial facilities under development, like Egypt and Kuwait. And again, we'd like to see those countries embrace CCS at a practical level, and like to see ideally projects come to fruition in those countries as well. So I mentioned that the CCS story in 2021 has exceeded our expectations, but we shouldn't forget that from where we are today, we need to scale up by a factor of 100 by 2050 to meet our climate targets. And at the Institute, we estimate that this requires around $1 trillion of capital investment in the next 3 decades. Of course, part of the solution will come from carbon markets, and Article 6's finalization in this sense is really important. when we look at the carbon markets, the voluntary carbon market in 2021 grew significantly to exceed $1 billion of volume by the end of the year. But in comparison, compliance markets, of course, are much bigger. They're more close to $300 billion in last year. But according to various different estimates, we expect to see the voluntary carbon markets also grow significantly in the next 10 years to maybe reach 50 to 100 billions. And needless to say, both markets will be important catalysts for CCS finance. Just bringing my comments to a close, what to watch out for in 2020 as we head to COP27 in Egypt. I know on the right-hand side, you can see some of the kind of key events and the roadmap to COP27. But I think two things that stand out for me is, of course, the NDC updates ahead of COP26. Will they get us on track for 1.5? And particularly for CCS, I think we'll be watching out for, as Tim mentioned, the supervisory body for Article 6.4. It's got the responsibility to review and potentially establish procedures and methodologies. And it will be curious to see whether they will review CCS modalities from the old CDM, and will they include them, and will they make recommendations on CDR? So that's one thing that I think the CCS community will watch for. And with that, I'd like to bring my remarks to a close. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. So I've got a couple of questions for you both, and there's also a lot of questions within the chat that we're going to get to. I just wanted to also sort of give my own reflections on this COP. I can only compare with COP15 in 2009 in Copenhagen, because that's the last time I worked on CCS and the only other time I've been involved in international policy. Back then I was working for the UK government. My reflection, though, was a very similar kind of event in terms of the number of people there, and how to navigate that event seemed very similar. But certainly then we were focused on, would CCS be included in the Clean Development Mechanism? The sort of equivalent discussion, obviously, this time round was, making sure that the principles for a global carbon market were actually technology neutrality, and that CCS and CDR would be in there, which is really good to see. I also noted how much the discussions around phasing out or phasing down fossil fuels really impacted, I think, the way that governments were approaching the discussions, and also some of the discussions in the industry and the government in the side events. So it seemed to me that, and it's interesting to see that there's kind of 18 NDCs with featuring CCUS now. I'd be really interested to see how that increases over the coming sort of 12 months. And maybe Tim can talk a little bit about the timelines for when we're going to see updates and things, because I think phase down fossil fuels, although it's not the most ambitious language, actually means that countries now have to look at CCUS, and those were certainly the discussions I was involved in with national governments. And some of those were on side events. There were 7 side events that CCSA was involved in, talking about CCUS, negative emissions technologies, CDR, and I think that's a huge increase. I think I went to 1, maybe 2 in Copenhagen back in 2009, and CCUS really wasn't top of the bill anywhere, and that felt like a real shift this time. I'd agree with what the others have said around some of the multinational agreements that were coming out throughout the course of the 2 weeks, added a feeling of momentum and pace on top of the normal waiting for new texts. It felt like those that could were running ahead with things, yeah, I think that did create a feeling of kind of movement, rather than just waiting for the end of the 2 weeks and the final text. One of the things I'm really interested to ask the panelists, and I'll ask them to come on now as I'm concluding, is certainly, you know, agreeing principles for the global carbon market is a great win for the COP, and really, really crucial for the future deployment of CCUS. But there was quite a lot of discussion about the voluntary carbon market inside events, and questions around the interaction with the compliance market, as it's called, within, you know, the UNFCCC process. So I think those that want to press ahead with projects now and use the voluntary carbon market, you know, are keen to do that. Perhaps some are keen to wait and see how discussions go on the global carbon market, but I'd be really interested to understand how you see those two interacting and how they might influence each other. And also, there's a question in the chat which relates to this, which I thought was quite a good question, I think, from Rebecca Bell, who asked, how do companies' net zero targets relate to governments' net zero targets? And how does emission trading between companies show up in national accounts? So just trying to get an understanding of how, you know, the huge effort of the private sector, which I think was really clear in COP26, there is now this pressure from investors and from the private sector, and they're trying to go as fast as they can with some of this, and kind of how that relates then to what in accounting terms is happening with governments, and what the compliance market that will be negotiated, the rules going forward, how that will fit together, I guess. So I guess, Galora, maybe you'd like to talk about that first, and then Tim, I'd be interested in your view.
Thank you. Indeed, I think it's really interesting, the interplay between voluntary and compliance markets. Until a few years ago, of course, I think, you know, when we looked at the sort of the markets ecosystem, the two of them were sort of almost completely separate, but as we're going, I mean, we're starting to observe, and I think we're going to observe even more, there's been a period of growth, and this is to paraphrase from an AITA, previous AITA conference, which I thought was a great way of describing a period of growth, transition, and convergence also potentially, in terms of the sort of the standards and both the standards and the market credits themselves. Obviously, leveraging voluntary market credits and standards for compliance purposes is already used to some degree in practice, for example, in CORSIA, but I think the Article 6 now gives potentially the opportunity to expand both of them, and there is potentially kind of, it intertwines them a little bit more. It's looking at governments, particularly, I think in official language, the parties, but the governments to, in effect, to authorize or to indicate what the credit is going to be used for, i.e. whether it's going to be used for domestically or internationally, and what, you know, therefore whether there needs to be a corresponding adjustment or not. And, you know, again, voluntary market credits may be kept in country, in which case there wouldn't be a corresponding adjustment, or if they're sort of exported or imported, that will be needed. So I think we're going to see how that evolves. I mean, it does look a little bit, to me, a little bit complicated at the moment. I think we're going to sort of see how it evolves in practice, but certainly kind of as also the voluntary market scales up, I anticipate that there will be a lot more sort of convergence potentially between the two marketplaces.
Great, and Tim, your thoughts on this?
Thanks, and I definitely defer to Galoran on this. Galoran's recently hosted a webinar on voluntary markets and CCUS, but I think what's important is the point that Galoran just made, that the Article 6 text now explicitly allows this interaction between the compliance markets, as in what countries have to do under Article 6, and the voluntary markets. There is this new acronym in there, other international mitigation purposes, and Article 6.4 ERs, emission reductions, can be used by countries for their NDCs, or they can be used for these other international mitigation purposes. So the door is now open for interaction between the two markets, and we'll see what happens.
So that should mean, to answer Rebecca's question, that should mean that trading between companies under a voluntary market should be visible going forward in terms of the country level position, because I think the question was really about how trading activities between companies would show up on the national emissions.
Well, it depends on how they're intended to be used.
Yeah.
And it depends whether the company has a compliance requirement upon it. Certainly within Europe, most of the facilities have to do that, have to report their emissions. And so there would have to be an interaction within a defined established market such as Europe. In other countries, you'd hope there would be some acknowledgement, some reflection of what companies do. You would hope that it's all caught in the national inventories. And again, this is why I think it's important to get direct air capture, get the reporting requirements in the IPCC greenhouse gas reporting guidelines agreed, so that any companies doing those can then be acknowledged within the country's emissions inventory and emissions reporting.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of, I mean, people obviously looking to the future, and I think it was really helpful that you both set out your thoughts on next steps. If I could be really kind of focused and sort of ask for your thoughts on what you might expect at the next COP. I mean, I think obviously next COP is in Egypt. Given the big sort of pieces that were agreed at this recent COP, do you think the next one will automatically be technical? I think there's a kind of suggestion here in the chat that, you know, we might assume the next COP is more technical. Does that seem like a fair assumption?
Should let Gloria go first on this one, as I've presented first.
Thank you, Tim. Of course, the UK will hold the presidency until it hands over, and one could argue that its influence might sort of, you know, diminish over time. But there have been some really big decisions and big sort of, agreements from COP26, and I think it's in UK government is really interested to see them through as much as possible. And with that, I'd probably highlight two aspects. I think President Sharma, I suspect, will try to continue kind of gentle nudge influence in order for some countries to increase their climate ambitions in their NDCs. Before COP27, countries are invited to update with the view of increasing their ambition ahead of Egypt. I think that will be one. And I think climate finance, kind of increasing climate finance to developing world, to countries like, again, sort of Vietnam, Indonesia, etc., will be kind of quite important. And I think that's, again, the second thing that I suspect we'll see a lot more action and diplomacy on. Tim, curious to hear your thoughts.
Okay, I agree with you, Galoran, on those, and I think it's really important for the UK to use its presidency to encourage further revisions and improvements in the NDCs. There's an explicit invitation for countries to do that, and yes, apparently Australia said they're not going to do that, but that's now. Pressure can be put on them diplomatically by the UK presidency to do that. The UK has just had a trade deal agreed with Australia. It didn't include climate, as far as I'm aware, but you know, the potential for further discussions, I'm sure, is there to all the diplomatic routes that the UK has. So obviously there's going to be the sort of detailed technical work as well on Article 6 in the SUBSTA meeting and by the supervisory body under the UK leadership. I think they should just continue to encourage the good practice that we've seen so far and the technology neutrality in those. And I think it probably will be a smaller COP. There was a big expectation at this COP. The attendee numbers, interesting that Ruth's comparison with Copenhagen, which was a really big one, something like 27,000 attended. And then they've introduced further restrictions on attendance after that. Paris was a similar level. Glasgow was not far off. I looked just today and it was 25,000 in person and maybe 15,000 more virtually formal delegates. I would expect Egypt would be smaller, but more focused on these details that need to be resolved. So a smaller and a more technical COP, to use the question asker terms themselves. And I think what the UK could also do is just use its presidency to include climate finance, to not exclude CCS. There was, the pressure is on, the agreements there to increase the finance to developing countries to reach the 100 billion per annum by 2023 now, but just to make sure that the actual donor organizations themselves don't exclude CCUS. And I'm thinking in particular of the Green Climate Fund, who have it in their remit to fund CCUS, but haven't done so yet. And yet the IEA tell us it's meant to be 25% of mitigation effort to achieve net zero by 2050. So encouragement by the UK, who is a donor in themselves, to not exclude this very important technology would be very welcomed as well.
In fact, there's a comment in the text here that the UK has CCUS funds, but they're not in the NDC. It was a question for Lauren. I sort of feel like maybe I should speak to that too, but Lauren.
I think it's a great question because I know that Tim and I kind of exchanged some notes on it. It is, one could sort of say implicitly in there, it's as a footnote, and I think it refers to the public consultations that are being undertaken a number of fronts, one of which includes CCS. But it's so, I wouldn't be surprised in the NDC update if it gets sort of further highlighted rather than kind of just as a sort of being included as a footnote.
I think we would like CCUS and the UK's cluster programme to be more prominently part of the country. It's very clearly front and centre of the UK's net zero strategy, published just before COP. So I think maybe it was a timing issue around when those had to be submitted, but we'd really expect it to be front and centre going forward. But I really like what you both said there around, UK making the full use of the rest of its presidency here, encouraging updated NDCs, focusing on the bits that really need to get sorted. And I think in particular, it's come out in the chat and the questions as well around comparison of nature-based carbon removal with engineered solutions and the details around how you compare these given different storage permanents, land footprints, costs, etc. So I think there's so much important work to be done in making sure we are treating things equally and equivalently throughout that process on Article 6. But I'm afraid we've run out of time. There's so many more good questions, and there's quite a few sort of technical clarification questions on your presentations. So I think what we will do is take those away and respond to those for everybody after the process. So all it remains for me to say is thank you very much, Tim and Lauren. That was really insightful. I hope everybody on the chat found that interesting and helpful, and we will get back to you on your questions. And thanks for engaging with this. All the slides and this recording will be circulated to you afterwards, and we will send those the rest of the Q&A too. So keep an eye on our social media and website for further information on our external webinars. Thanks again, Tim and Lauren. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ruth and team.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for all the good questions, everyone.
Thank you.